Hi everyone. Round 11 for the candidates is in the books. Starting at the top, the draw artist formerly known as Anish Giri, once again lived up to his name, coming home with a peaceful result for mom and dad, or at least his wifey. He was unable to convert on a clear advantage against Hikaru Nakamura, and with that, he gets his 11th straight half point. In the next game, we had Veselin Topalov unable to convert on pressure that transitioned from the opening into the early middle game against Fabiano Caruana. That game also ended peacefully, though, to the disappointment of some fans wishing that it had continued on, including some tweets from a well-known grandmaster. Now, Levon Aronian was perhaps playing his most critical game of the tournament as white against a player that I think he felt himself he should beat. Considering that he pushed a position past the point where it needed to be pushed, you would think that he probably was thinking just like that. And he ended up losing a huge game to the Russian veteran in Peter Svidler, and with it may have cost himself his own candidate's chances, not at least coming away with a half a point, let alone a full point that he might have had a chance to get in the early middle games of an isolated queen pawn that is going to be very instructive. So stay around for Levon Aronian's game. And then finally, what can we say about Vishy Anand? The man is in charge. He is large. He won again. That's what we can say about it. And this time taking down one of the tournament leaders in Sergey Karjakin, who seemed to have luck on his side, right? Lady Luck had been with him, being worse in a couple other games earlier in this event, but not today, as Vishy Anand finds a way to grind it out and take down Sergey Karjakin. With it, he jumps into the lead with the American Fabiano Caruana. We are set for some incredible games in the final 3 rounds of the candidates. If you can't hear it, my voice is hoarse. I am excited. I love preparing these games for all of you. I love the opportunity to instruct upon the critical moments. And with that, let's not waste anything else. Let's save all our energy for what's happening on the board and jump into the first one here between Anish Giri and Hikaru Nakamura. Now, this was an exciting one, despite what the peaceful result may suggest to you, and of course my jokes about Anish Giri being the draw artist that he is. But he mixed things up a little bit by playing e4, already maybe surprising Hikaru, because Anish doesn't play e4 very often, at least not outside of rapid. But he did today, and he played an Italian, the Italian growing in popularity. Maybe these guys watch Chess Center where Mike and I predicted it. But after bishop to c5, we don't even get knight f6. There's, of course, many options here for white, including the Evans Gambit, which, as Robert Hess said in his analysis for Chess.com, that Hikaru Nakamura used to beat him. Of course, c3 is the mainline Giocco piano. There's d3 right away. There's all kinds of things. But Anish goes for the slightly less popular move order compared to all of them, just castles. And after knight f6 plays d3, so we're transposing. d6 is played, and now c3. And nothing special has happened so far. When you get this flexible pawn structure, white has a few things going for him. One, he can expand at d4 in a moment's notice. He can also play on the queen side at a moment's notice. And of course, the pawn on c3, despite what many beginners may believe, is actually often more useful in a symmetrical e4, e5 structure than a knight on c3. Now hold your horses. I know many of you amateurs and beginners out there are like, wait a second, I thought we're supposed to develop knights before bishops. I thought we're supposed to get everybody out. Well, the thing is, when you have a symmetrical structure, by definition, you're going to have squares that have been left behind by those pawns, squares that are potentially exposed on both sides of the center. And so you have to anticipate your opponent's desire to use those squares with the minor pieces. And so as you evolve and learn how to evaluate positions based on the middle game plan and not just let me get developed and get castled and then willy-nilly I'll figure it out, then moves like c3 become a lot more interesting to you and you start to understand the goal. Plus, if you consider the squares that are weak based on how black played, it shouldn't be a surprise to you anymore when you see common plans in the Ruy Lopez and in the Italian, where this pony relocates itself from d2 to f1 to e3 and into one of these squares or into g3. So remember that, and if you're ever wondering in the future about where these mysterious pawn moves come from at the Super Grandmaster level, maybe some of my advice will be useful to you. After a6, we have a4. Now, Robert Hess made the comment that he finds this move very interesting and is surprised that it's not played more often. Of course, the main moves here for white are the more typical moves we already discussed: d4, b4, knight b to d2. But a4 is a flexible move that makes sense and tries to expand on the queen side. After Hikaru castled, we had rook to e1, now bishop to a7, which is a very common thing. The bishop doesn't want to be constantly under the fire of tempo, so it puts itself on a safe square. Now that the bishop isn't going to be attacked with tempo, white decides to use his extra tempo to stop this bishop from coming to g4. Pretty typical stuff. h6, knight b to d2, knight to e7. A little bit interesting here. The knight retreats to e7. We've seen this happen in different lines of the Italian, where black has a few things coming after this, perhaps trying to play c6 and then d5. In some positions, d5 right away. In other positions, the knight may just come to g6 and into f4. So the knight to e7 is a very common relocating move. After knight to f1, indeed, we see knight to g6, and with knight to g3, here comes c6. All moves we're talking about, nothing should be that surprising based on how I've been describing this position to you, as long as you're paying attention. Bishop to a2, now here comes bishop to e6. What's interesting about this is, okay, so this is the game continuation that happens here with with bishop to e6, and analyzed by both myself and Robert Hess was that the move d5 right away is also a possibility for black. Now, at first, I know what you're thinking. Hold on a second. Aren't there opportunities to take, and after knight takes, to take on e5? Well, there would be if it wasn't for a very common tactical pattern that you should make yourself aware of in all of these Gioco Piano Italian games. Whenever the bishop is on this diagonal, there's a very important trick here. We chop town and take town, inducing the king to come up into ouch town, and then we apply a fork town on the king and the rook, and white's going to lose the material that he just gained back. So if you have that tactic in mind, that's a pattern you're aware of, you should be able to see this move d5 as something in your radar in the future. And not to say that it was necessarily that much better. Of course, Giri's not going to take on e5. He's going to play d4. And after a few moves, we get interesting and kind of typical dynamic stuff that happens when these Italian games open up. You can check it out, of course, the full analysis over at the news reports at Chess.com. But we just wanted to highlight that that was a main other option that Hikaru could have chosen besides bishop to e6, that's all. After takes, f takes, d4, c takes, takes. You may at first think, well, didn't d4 undouble black's e-pawns? But the problem is that with less space and these pawns not having anybody defending them behind them, there's still potential weaknesses, even if they're not doubled. And white controls most of the critical squares because these pawns are further advanced. If you want to go old school Aaron Nimzovich on this, white is actually better by 2 points in the center, as these pawns are worth 2 because they're on the 4th rank, and these pawns are only worth 1 on the 3rd rank. So you do the math, and I'm pretty sure that's 4 to 2, so hopefully my math is correct. And that's important to understand, that it's mainly just about who has more access behind their furthest advanced pawns. Space, defined in chess, are the squares available to your pieces behind your furthest advanced pawns. Remember that. Space in chess are the squares and, let's say, maneuverability available to you and your pieces behind your furthest advanced pawns. That theme is important for this game because Giri converts on his space advantage for something concrete and probably could have gotten the full point. But then again, we've said that before with Anish, haven't we? Hikaru doesn't just want to sit on the structure. He strikes with d5 because he knows he's just playing a worse structure in the center. And that makes sense. Now, the first thing that most people would think of is e5, but it's actually the worst way to play the structure. After the knight moves back to d7, the d-pawn is actually backward here with no support, and the move c5 coming might actually help to undermine the lead e5 pawn. So that's actually the smart decision by Giri not to play e5. And instead, he took on d5, opening up the file and hopefully trying to take advantage of some weaknesses. Now, this isn't the last critical moment for Hikaru, but it's one where he did start to get on his heels a little bit when he didn't take back on d5 with the correct move. If you want to pause your video and guess how would you take back, go ahead and do so. Okay, since it's not a hugely critical moment, I just want to test you and see if you care about pausing your video. Don't worry, you passed. The correct move is actually knight takes d5, sacrificing the e6 pawn with a surprising shot, knight to h4. Now, the idea here is that after takes and takes, yes, you're down a pawn as black, but how does white defend the d4 pawn? If bishop to e3, we chop, and if rook takes, we just take it, and if pawn takes, the pony hangs. right? So you might consider moves like rook to e4, but there are actually several simple moves in the position that just leave white with something to be desired as far as coordination goes. So black probably should have chosen activity and this sort of potential initiative over keeping the structure together. But e takes d5 was played fast by Hikaru because it kind of looks like the only move to play, right? The e6 pawn is hanging. But now after queen to d3 gaining a tempo, and then the very nice and simple developing move bishop to d2, which is headed for b4, Giri starts to put Nakamura back on his heels a little bit. Bishop to b8, we get bishop to b4. In case you haven't noticed, that's a pinned pony on e7. Bishop to d6 offers the exchange. Giri maybe could have played queen a3 here. I'm not sure it's that big of an advantage compared to the move in the game, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. But after bishop takes d6 and then rook to e3, we see that the space advantage I highlighted earlier is now leading to immediate and more dominant control over the few open files, those being the E and the C files. Critical control over the community accessible squares, right? If you're in a position where one side's playing totally on the queen side, that's my community, and you're on the king side, that's your community, then maybe we don't challenge each other as much. But when there are only a few open files that everybody has to share, the first person to get control over those things is generally in the driver's seat, right? Haven't you ever read a book about people being stranded on the island? Whoever gets the most valuable commodity, all of a sudden it's Lord of the Flies, and you know what happens. So this is a better position for Giri because he has control over the open lines on the board. There's threats here, there's b5, there's all that kind of stuff. And so after black tries to get rid of the threat of b5 because the queen was pinned, white continues anyway. Just plays b5, opens up lines, and with it is going to isolate the d and the b pawns. Sometimes space advantages lead to concrete weaknesses for your opponent, and that's kind of where we're headed here. After knight to d6, queen to b3, b5, the move rook to c to e1, we still see the open file in white's control. Queen a5, queen to b1, queen to b6, and now a fun move for white, which really starts to set the tone that black needs to be careful. Giri plays queen to g6, and at this moment, black had a huge decision to make, calculating Giri's pressure. Nobody likes having the enemy's first lady right in their home territory, right? But Hikaru needed to calculate accurately, and the move that he pretty much had to play here was the move queen takes d4. He could have taken the money and run, right? Just like Billy Joel and Bobby Sue, right? Go on, take the money and run. Don't tell me you don't get that song. Queen takes d4, knight to c6. Rook takes e3 would have been the shocker. You can't take the queen because I get two rooks for the queen. And after rook takes, queen back to b2. Surprisingly, at the end of this line, white has a very nice perpetual check to stave off the threats of checkmate, starting with queen to c1, fears f Chitiri. We get a little repetition, and it should have been a draw. So Hikaru should have taken on d4 and taken his chances here. As soon as he commits to c7, probably this was Giri's game to win, and eventually his game to give up the draw. After queen to d3, rook to e6, the knight comes back to e2. There's actually some interesting other ideas possibly, but this is a really nice move coming up on knight f4. The rook goes to e7, knight f to g6, rook e6, queen to b1. All seems normal. Here the move queen to b4 was played. Another interesting idea was actually the move g4, but we're going to go with what Giri did because it wasn't that big of a deal. Knight f5, rook to f3, knight e7. And again, Giri is avoiding trades, but he also potentially could have swapped on e7 and then grabbed the newly minted open file over here and still been much better in pressing. But he decides that he has the more space, and so keeping the pieces on the board makes sense, which you can't really blame him. Knight c6, queen to b2, rook e7, rook f to e3, knight to a7. You might be saying, what was Hikaru thinking? Well, try to suggest another move. If you take on e5, we take, and black ends up losing material after f3 because the pony is pinned. If you don't take on e5, and instead try to play something like queen to b6, you're still losing material after knight to g6, rook e6, and then a very nice combination that ends up having an x-ray where the rook defends the knight through the enemy piece. So we have all kinds of just troubled tactics here for black, and that's what space can lead to. Space gives your pieces more options. More options makes your pieces more powerful. More powerful pieces get more tactics. Hey, you just learned more about chess. Instead, black played knight a7. Hikaru's actually avoiding the tactics here, but on queen to b3, knight to c8, the pressure is coming. Again, possibly rook to c3, switching back to the c file and coming up to c5 to just pick up pawns might have been better for Giri. Instead, he goes queen to b4, knight d7, h4. After we get some trades, this still should have been very close to being just a knockout blow. Queen to d4 feels a little bit like the warm and cozy move that Giri played. Honestly, queen to g4, threatening knight f6 check and putting pressure on g7 was probably more accurate, mainly because after queen e6, you can just come back to g3, and there's no way for black to slow down the e-pawn here. And that, again, might have been better for Giri. I say the warm and cozy move because I am a little critical of Giri's inability to convert on some of these large advantages where it feels like a more concrete calculation approach instead of relying on, just a strategical feels-good feeling, let the position convert itself on its own. I mean, he did blow wins in the tournament against Fabiano Caruana in a similar fashion. So not getting the concrete approach taken here, instead settling on queen to d4, it's still not that the position isn't much better here. Okay, don't get me wrong. He did not have to play this terrible blunder that he's about to play. Rook to e5 would have been fine, and the truth is White's winning the d5 pawn and should still be able to go on to grind Nakamura. But in this position, he gives up the entire win with the move, knight takes g7. I don't know what he miscalculated here, but he literally just sacrificed a piece. And after queen takes g7, rook g3, he must have just missed rook to g5. Because the point is, maybe he thought he could take it and still win the piece, but I take back. And if you take with the pawn, I win your queen. So rook to g5 is not a very hard desperado move to think of your opponent playing, especially when they're lost. Because of it, he ended up taking on g5 and then trading on d5. They ended up agreeing on a draw here. As Robert Hess noted, and I tend to agree with him, probably if anybody could have played for a win now, it was Nakamura. Is Black really in a position to win? Most likely results a draw, even on a move like knight e7. White could probably take here, and after takes here, White might still be in good position to draw, or even trade queens. And with so many pawns, you might be able to hold the b-pawn and use this big pawn mass for something. But it was sort of a messy affair just to see Giri not be able to convert one more time. Nakamura really only missing his chance right back here when he didn't play the active queen takes d4 after queen to g6, which of course we talked about. But otherwise, Giri was in the driver's seat the whole time. So the American escapes. The draw artist continues his wonderful ways. And now we're going to move on to the other really interesting battle between Veselin Topalov and Fabiano Caruana and see what that game had in store for us. Now, the English attack seems to remain high on everybody's list as far as openings to play at the Candidates Tournament, although this is one of the first times we've seen the symmetrical English, no longer the E5 topical stuff. And despite the seemingly copycat moves, the truth is both players came to play and play for the win in this game. Already here we get a very dynamic version of a Nimzo English hybrid type of system where White would love to play e4 and just dominate with the Maroczy bind, but then Black comes out to b4 and causes disruption to the queen side. So this is a very sharp line. The players came to play. On that note of coming to play, the last time that this line was played at a high level was in the game between Sergey Karjakin and Hikaru Nakamura, although I need to remind myself who was White in that game. It was actually Hikaru Nakamura was White against Sergey Karjakin in this game that I'm about to show you. After knight f to g4, the move queen to a4 was played by Hikaru. That was the last time this system was featured at the, we'll say, between the players in this tournament, the highest of highest levels, the top 10 in the world, all these studs. That game was at the Zurich Chess Challenge in 2015. In that game, Karjakin played g5, and after bishop takes e5, queen takes f2. Let's just say this was a bowl full of jelly and then some preparation. In the end, Hikaru Nakamura ended up getting the better of the Russian, winning this game as White, based mainly due to better preparation. But it was an absolute mess. I encourage you to go check out that game. Again, from 2015, Nakamura versus Karjakin. But in this situation, Topalov was not interested in repeating Hikaru's efforts with queen a4. Maybe they've discovered, I'm sure they have reviewed those lines. All these guys look at each other's games. Maybe they've discovered that Black has an improvement on queen a4. Who knows? Maybe it's queen takes f2 right away. I can't figure this stuff out. But Topalov decided I'm just going to play e3, which is also good for White. After a6, queen to a4, pins the pawn to the rook. Rook to a7, which is just an absolute just hilarious move, right? You're just giving up a rook on a7, but the point is, if you take it, guess who hangs on b2, right? Plus, we got these knights coming into f3 check, and you're probably getting mated. This is one of the most interesting dynamic lines that I wish I knew in the English, because every time I look at these variations, I'm just like, right? What is going on here? And all I have to do is trust the theory and trust the giant lizard friend Komodo that sits next to me and analyzes it. But I'll say the position is about dynamically equal, and that's kind of what happened here, with white getting an edge that Topalov maybe could have converted on, but it was a mess the whole way. h3 is played, and you might be thinking, what's going on with a subtle move like h3 in the middle of this position? Well, the knight here is serving a very important purpose. It's defending the other knight, and so black is finding the pieces sort of overloaded here. That's why he has to take on b5, and after queen takes, queen to c6. You're saying white's down a piece, isn't he? Well, kinda, but actually after h takes g4, queen takes h1, and then takes e5, white's only down the exchange, and with an extra pawn to go with it, if you do the math, black has 6 pawns, white has 7 pawns, and black's king being in the center, probably white is better here. Again, I'm going on what I learned from this game, what I've learned from the players in the analysis, the depth of analysis I've put into just preparing the video. But Topalov really was in the driver's seat here, and if I'm gonna suggest who I would play for white this position, it would be white. The lack of development, the uncoordinated rook, and the pressure that Topalov got here speaks for itself. Queen to c6, no, we're not trading queens right away, but it's not because we're not going to allow it. After bishop d4, if you take, your rook will have no safe squares to move to that don't allow forks. So black doesn't trade, rook a7 and now a3, again, just preventing black from playing any active moves. Bishop to e7, queen h5, and after king f8, castle's long, and as Caruana said in the game, this did not look good for me. Let's take stock, shall we? White is only down a pawn for the exchange, so material almost equal. The king on f8 creates permanent dysfunction in black's setup, and white seems to just have some natural moves to come forward and put pressure. Instead of castle's long, both c5, which is a move that kind of blocks in the bishop and is protected twice, as well as just bishop to d3 right away, might have also been possible for white. So if we see this line again, assuming black has the chutzpah, right, the cojones to go for this again at the high levels, I expect white to get some really nice wins. I'm going to bet that black doesn't go for this again anytime soon. After castle's long, b6, this was a good move, a smart move by Caruana, because he's getting counterplay right where he needs it against the c4 pawn, especially now with the king on c1. And after king to b1, bishop a6, white says, I'm not going to let you have it, plays knight to b5. And on rook to d8, it wouldn't be fair to say this is a moment where Topalov misses a big chance, because he was still better. But the move g5, cementing more difficulties for black to ever coordinate over here. And after the move e5, bishop back to c3, queen to g6, the point is that we are not afraid of this queen trade winning another pawn. And in a position where we're getting more than a few pawns, it's hard to say that white isn't the one in the driver's seat of this endgame, although a very nice move was found. That move is d5. Kind of a kamikaze pawn points out that the rook can't take, and the pawn can't take, because then I take your bishop, and that's pinned to the rook. So maybe d5 is a move that saves the day and holds the balance for black. But g5 was an interesting try for white regardless. And backing up just a few moves, I'm making sure I didn't miss any of the critical analysis I planned on showing you. I kind of did, actually. I want to go back to this moment here because I do like to leave everybody with some knowledge about the line overall and not just random awkward jokes by Danny, but actually really take home some knowledge here. I think if we saw this again at the highest levels after bishop to e7, which was sort of a Swiss gambit by Fabiano saying, are you really going to take my pawn with your bishop? Because if not, I'm going to try to get my king safe. Probably you could argue that Topalov could have taken the pawn. And after bishop takes rook g8, bishop d4, after rook to g4, queen b3, a really straightforward approach by white that just allows this crazy sacrifice of the rook on a1. I'll just show you what happens. If you take it, we take on d7. You have to run to f8, and we take on b7 anyway. This position is just an absolute mess for black. So if you can't just go take a1, and instead you're playing queen h1, king e2, and then bishop takes b5 check, queen takes, queen c6, this endgame showed to be really, really difficult for black. If you take f6, I check and win back my exchange, and I've got a lot of pawns if I'm white. So still, deeper analysis needed by engines. This is a lot of people reacting to what the best players in the world are doing. We're all in this boat together, right? Let's try not to drown or enter a white squall like Jeff Bridges did in that movie. What was he thinking, right? But the point is, in this position, I just wanted to leave you with some theoretical knowledge that maybe bishop takes g7 is something we'll see again, and not just Topalov's queen h5 move. So we get back to the position I was just talking about, Caruana launching decent counterplay. But here, instead of g5 and going for the endgame, I highlighted where maybe black has that nice d5 shot in the end. White played bishop to c3 instead. And even though it doesn't seem like black is out of the woods yet, the king is still on f8, the rooks are still disconnected. Already, the more pieces come off the board, the more you feel like, oh, black is maybe holding this, right? I am up the exchange if I'm the second player. Topalov played rook to d2. He said his original intention was to play rook to d4 and to head to f4. However, after bishop f6, rook f4, and then queen d1 check, he wasn't thrilled with the position after g5 and then queen takes b5, opening up the pin. So because of that, which was maybe something he miscalculated originally, he had to settle on rook to d2, which already is changing the game. And after bishop f6, the truth is, with the king almost working its way out, and with now white playing moves like bishop d6, which are nice and cute and make you feel real warm and cozy, but where's white's threat, right? You're down the exchange. Already you feel like black is getting closer to getting out of this. Rook c8, queen h3, I think a lot of the commentators were thinking, is Caruana going to find a way to pull this game off right now, right? Which would just be massive for his position in terms of the standings and chances to win the candidates and play Carlsen. But it wasn't over yet. Topalov played bishop to b4. Now there is a threat, of course, on the queen, so the queen moves. Bishop to f1, h5. An interesting move by Caruana, aggressively trying to get the rook on h8 into the game, which means I don't need to get castled because my rook can find new avenues into the fray. Bishop to g2, queen takes g4. We get this funny-looking endgame where, at first, I'm thinking that how is this not a huge victory for Caruana? He got the queens off the board. He survived the worst of it. But somehow he didn't really like the position enough to just play for the simple endgame up the exchange. Commentators were very critical, and rightfully so, of him not to just take on f4. Note that g takes loses on the spot to g3 because the pawn is pinned to the rook. And that means that if e takes is played, I bring my king out. And how is this not something that Topalov would not just hate as white? The king is going to stop the pawns. Black is up the exchange, and really sad for Caruana that he didn't go for a very straightforward way to win up the exchange. He played bishop to e7, thinking that this bishop needed to keep an eye on the potential queenside expansion. But I think he was overestimating the queenside expansion and came to regret it. After e4, bishop c5, e5, a very cute point, of course, is that you can't take on f2 with the rook because I will trade and then pick up your rook. So after rook to e1, rook c2, g5, we get funny stuff. Bishop takes g5, rook takes e5, bishop e6. And I just want to point out that the game was agreed to a draw on rook d5. Again, that's where the criticism came from fans and top players, like, what's going on here? But if we're gonna show the lines that were probably calculated on rook to d5, I'm going to jump to that right here. After rook to d5, bishop e4, there are a few options for black. One is that if you take on f2, we trade, take on d5, and then bishop e5, and the crazy lines show that just maybe, the queen side competes with black's king side in a crazy line like this. Now, if you don't take on f2, there is also rook to d1, but here we get the funny-looking rook takes c5, and all of a sudden, white's got a lot of threats with his own pawns, and ends up getting two bishops for the rook, and white's in control of the position. So if you're not taking on f2, and if you're not playing rook to d1, if you're playing rook to d4, kind of giving up the exchange in a simple way, white still says no and takes on c5, and we get some funky monkey stuff here, though in the end I had a feeling that black should still be in the driver's seat here somehow, although although the analysis by the players said this was bad for black because he's not getting enough checkmate threats and these pawns are out of control. So, could you justify Caruana's agreement to the draw or even offer the draw on rook to d5 back here because of these crazy lines with bishop e4? Yes, probably, but it left the fans a little disappointed, especially given that both of these players wanted to win. Topalov still wanting to get a big victory here to salvage a decent tournament, and Caruana playing for the right to play Magnus Carlsen. So frustrating stuff. I think in the end, Caruana missed the biggest chance for the win. Why in the world he didn't just take on f4 and convert the extra exchange ending? But the truth is Topalov was the one pushing from the middle game into from the opening. So maybe it's poetic justice in the end. But either way, we move on to our first decisive game of the day between Levon Aronian and Peter Svidler. Again, one of the most exciting and instructive games of the tournament coming from the Russian veteran. I've been enjoying Peter Svidler's games as much as anyone, and let's jump in to see how he managed to win a huge game as black against the Armenian. Now, I promised you it would be instructive, and it is. It's an isolated queen-pawn game between these two. Starting off with a semi-Slav dc4a4. Of course, we used to see bishop f5 when everybody and their cousin and sister's brother's uncle's lawyer used to play this stuff, but bishop f5 is no longer really in vogue. And here, Svidler just plays the simple e6 stuff. We get e3, c5, typical Queen's Gambit decline, Yaroslav structure, black trying to equalize. After knight c6 castles and cd, guess what we have? We have an IQP, boys and girls, and this is dynamic chess at its best. Isolated queen's pawns offer all kinds of play for both sides. It's how you play for a win. Bishop to e7, bishop to e3. A really nice line quoted by Robert Hess in his analysis is that the professor, Tomaszewski, the last time he had this position, played queen to e2. And I just wanted to show it because it's a really sexy way to show how you win with an isolated queen pawn. Getting more control over the center squares. These knights being active is something we'll see that Aronian had in the game, followed by the brilliant and never forget it rook lift, rook a3, a big swing to the king's side from the queen's side, and grabbing the h-file led to just an awesome attack for white. And I just love seeing when the IQP in the better space turns into really fun attacking chances over here on the king's side, and took a little while, but the professor was able to win his white. A fun game that I got to show. You're thinking, Danny, what does that have to do with the candidates? Well, I have the microphone and you don't, so you're going to listen to every bleeping word I have to say, right? Adam Sandler #wedding singer reference. So instead, bishop to e3 was played, which is totally fine. And don't forget that game, because I think it is actually instructive to see how the best players use isolated queen pawns to launch attacks on the king side. Queen to e2, we're getting similar stuff. Why does black play knight to b4 in all these lines? Well, I'll tell you, you need to control the square in front of the IQP always, because as soon as you start putting pieces there, it either forces your opponent to exchange minor pieces, which is not what they really want when they're looking for activity, given that their center pawn is better than yours. And it also prevents tactics of white forcing the d5 pawn through. So knight to b4 is a critical thing. Knight to e5, bishop to d7, rook to d1, knight d5, and then bishop to c1. This is a new move. Previously, f4 had been played. Also an idea that makes sense. A way to use the isolated pawn and the bishop on this diagonal is to try to punch f5 through. You can definitely check out the analysis of this variation over at the news report. But bishop to c1 was played by Aronian. Also a move that makes a whole lot of sense. And after bishop to c6, rook to d3, knight takes c3, b takes c3. We already see the makings of a potentially very strong attack on the king side. Why is it that isolated queen pawns can potentially lead to these attacking positions on the king side? Well, the person with the pawn is playing for the open files adjacent to the pawn. By definition, if the pawn is isolated, then you have files open next to it because there's no pawns there. So read between the lines, right? The squares around the pawn are typically available to your minor pieces because your pawn is usually the more furthest advanced pawn in the center compared to the e6 pawn. So if you have the more active pieces on the open files and squares, typically what would be, if you could choose everything to do with all your active pieces, what would be the number one thing normally at the top of your list? Attacking the opponent's king, right? If your pieces are more active and more powerful. So it's normal that you see white looking to use the squares and the more active pieces to try to put pressure where it matters most. And that's kind of what white's trying to do here. Rook to g3, bishop takes c4, knight takes c4, G6, knight e5, all very typical stuff. Here comes bishop h6, rook e8. And now after f4, bishop f8, bishop g5, we get a really cute move by Aronian that I think puts Svidler on his heels and may have been the right road for him to get the victory. He found this move knight to g4. Very, very nice. It's obviously headed into dark squares if you give it the opportunity, but it also avoids the complete liquidation, right? If he just repeats, we have a draw. If you sit, white probably has to deal with the threat of trading here and here all at once, right? Black wants to take away all of white's pieces so that I don't get checkmated. Knight g4 says, Dikembe Mutombo finger in your face. Nay, not happening. And whether I get a checkmate attack or not, if you take here and I take, you can't take with the queen because I have discoveries, multiple ones. And because of that, Black had to play h5 and kick the knight from the square, which is, by the way, going to be an extension that hopefully Black regrets. This is the way Aronian would be thinking. The bishop took on e7 now and came back to e5, but there's a difference. Because the pawn has been pushed and the squares have been weakened, if you take now, I take with the f-pawn, my rook comes into f6, and Bob's your uncle. I might be sacking and mating you very quickly on the king side. So it may not have been forced for white to take on e7, but the advantages are here. There's threats of queen takes h5 immediately in this position because the g-pawn is pinned. There's threats of knight takes g6. Aronian was bringing the heat. King h7, queen to c2 is played. Again, we renew the threat of taking the h-pawn. This time the pin is happening on a different straight line of the chessboard, the diagonal. King to h8 was played. Robert Hess made a really nice observation that f5 might have actually been Black's best move. As ugly as that looks, and believe me, I'm no fan of these violent cartoons with Tom and Jerry either, right? And all this Swiss cheese running around and animals fighting each other for it. But if I don't have a concrete way to break down that pawn structure, maybe this is the best way to limit the attack. Instead, after king h8, here Aronian makes a move that Hess was critical of and I agree with. He played the move rook f3, which allows Black to now take on e5 in a timely way, taking away the opportunity that I said would happen if you ever took. I was going to take with the f-pawn, if you remember what I said earlier, and then bring my rook in and really bring the pressure. Now I can't, because if I take with the f-pawn, I lose the rook. So Robert made a point to say that probably queen to d2 was the best for white. Protect the rook so that you can't take here, and then continue to do the rook lift. If I get the rook to h3 and play g4, I'm going to go ahead and guarantee checkmate. I might even Babe Ruth this thing and call my shot, call my checkmate on f7 or something crazy. But no, in all seriousness, this was the way to go. After rook f3, Svidler doesn't miss his opportunity to take it. And, okay, obviously f takes wasn't played because of the rook. And after rook takes e5, we just don't look at this position the same way we did when all of Aronian's activity was leading to great attacking chances from the isolated queen pawn, right? The position has been simplified. People are playing natural defending moves now, and white's going to keep making one move threats at a time, but it wasn't enough. After rook to c8 and then rook to b8, you could almost argue at this point Black had already equalized. And despite being down the pawn, the threats potentially against white's king and white's weak pawn should have had Aronian a little more worried than he was. In the game, he played the move rook to b5, which we're going to come back to saying is a big mistake, and officially white was on the defensive. If he had played h3 and created some luff for the king, it's possible things could have been okay still. Queen c6, d5, we get a trade, and then after takes, not takes on c3, ganging up on c3, white's a little better still at the pawn, but black is kind of holding. h3 would have been the safest route for the king, though. Instead, rook to b5 was played, and now on rook takes and queen a3, we see threats of both this, threats of queen to c1 check, and Aronian still maybe wanting to win. Again, you understand the desire, the tournament situation, he has a lot to play for. He was better earlier, and it's a very common emotional trap. It's emotional when you've been better from start to finish. Maybe you got exactly the opening you were looking for. I think he did. Maybe you even got your preparation. Bishop to c1 was a new move, right? And after that, you got all the pressure and the heat you could have asked for, at least just to have chances to win against one of the best players in the world. That's all these guys want. And when you got all those things and yet somehow it didn't convert itself to a clear advantage, it's very normal to be frustrated and to still convince yourself that you can play for a win in a position where maybe you've actually lost the thread and should be looking to equalize. So if you can learn anything from these guys as far as that psychological mistake goes, hopefully you notice it. It's good to get up sometimes, take a break, be psychologically objective if you can, and don't beat yourself up for previous mistakes. Here he's continuing to push for a win where maybe he doesn't have the right to play for it anymore. And I'm saying all this stuff now because this is a critical moment, and maybe the best thing he should have done was sack down and go for the perpetual check. Rook takes g6, check a Ruski, take on c8, and let black get the perpetual check that he desires. That might have been Aronian's best chance, but he still didn't want it. Instead, he played queen to c2, but after rook to b8, getting the b-pawn naturally, white ends up being on the defensive big time. Queen c1 check and queen takes f4. Checks again. King to g8 is an exclamaviach by the Russian surname right there. He removes the threat of even heading into the endgame and trading queens. And now, white's not up material. White has more pawn weaknesses and checks to deal with than black did, even though white was the one with all the pressure earlier. And it's just really tough for white. Queen to b2, a6. c4 is played, we take, and then queen e4. And again, there's threat of queen to e1 mate. Queen to d2, here comes queen to b1, and rook a8. And guess what happened after queen e1 and queen b2 check? Aronian resigned. How quickly did that game just turn around, right? Are you kidding me? He had all the pressure on the king side. He had the isolated queen pawn in the preparation he wanted. But rook to b5 and then queen to c2, just wanting to win when he probably had lost the threat. It's a difficult thing, a heartbreaking loss for Levon. But also a resourceful victory for Peter Svidler. Sometimes the advantage of being down is you don't expect much. You keep going. Before you know it, your opponent gives you chances, and Bob's your uncle. So let's move on to the game of the day, the second decisive matchup between Vishy Anand and Sergey Karjakin, and see what that game had in store for us. Now, as we all know, I have to control myself from time to time when I get really excited, but I will say that this game just highlighted to me one of my favorite principles to teach, and watching Vishy grind out this endgame in a way that was sort of textbook conversion of a small advantage is just really exciting. And I'm going to encourage everybody to check out Maxime Vachier-Lagrav's analysis, of course, over at the news reports. He's diving into all of the game of the day stuff over there. Give a little picture there. We want to give a little shout out to my boy. But this game and the principles I'm going to highlight for you to take home from an educational perspective, and just wondering how was Vishy able to convert on a very small advantage in an opposite colored bishop ending. I'm going to explain why, and hopefully you enjoy it along the way. So after knight f6, d3, we see another anti-Berlin. This is Vishy's bread and butter at this point, right? Bishop c5, c3 castles. Now this line is not the most common variation, especially after bishop to d3 and then the move d5 by black. The first time this move was played was by Kramnik against Magnus Carlsen. Now, in that game, Carlsen played the move knight b to d2 and actually went on to win. That game was interesting, dynamic, but eventually Carlsen got the best of Kramnik. Apparently, there may have been some improvement for black in those lines. Vishy decides, I'm not interested in playing the way Carlsen did, and just plays knight takes e5. Although I'll note real quick that the main move for many years in this position was just knight to g6, played by greats such as Boris Spassky. Again, we just saw this structure in the Italian game, right, between Giri and Nakamura. So we understand that knight to g6 makes some sense. But d5 is the dynamic way to play. And after knight takes e5 rather than knight b to d2, it's clear that Vishy must have had something prepared. Knight takes e4, knight b to d2 now. The point is, when you get a symmetrical structure, the first person to get control of the few things that become open, again, I've been saying this because I think at this level, when these guys have such little things to play for, it's a teaching concept that comes up organically all the time, right? Where you either have symmetrical structures or you have a position that was full of just neck and neck stuff the whole way, and then one side gets one advantage and it seems exponential, where all of a sudden that one little thing can really grow very quickly. Well, when you have a symmetrical structure, whoever gets control and can dictate the few open files and the few open diagonals that will happen on the board will end up being in the driver's seat for a long time. Whether they're always able to win or not is another question, but practical pressure is worth something even at the highest level. And after the next few moves, we see this symmetrical structure here. still totally symmetrical, turn into some big exchanges where the only open file ends up being the D file. Now, at first you think, didn't all the pieces just come off the board, and how are they not just agreeing to a draw here? I'm going to tell you right now, I'll feed you baby birds. Black isn't in as easy a position to draw as you might think, okay? Karjakin even said in the post-game interview, which you should go check out Peter Docker's video on that he figured after the queens came off the board, this position should be an easy draw. But this is why I love Vishy. His preparation is just insane. I feel like he understands where he can play small advantages for a very long time against his peers, and he does it again right here. Again, I would say Vishy did his best Magnus Carlsen impression in this game, taking down Sergey Karjakin, because as the Russian said, I thought the position should be a pretty easy draw with the queens off the board, but there's only one open file, and there's only one man who owns that open file, and that's the Tiger from Madras, okay? This time I'm not mispronouncing where he's from. That open file is never going to fall into the hands of Black for the next umpteen moves. Along with, you combine that with the ability to play tickle and create weaknesses on both sides of the board, and it's no wonder why White is able to push for a win. Did Black have chances to draw? Of course he did, but remember, open files are governed by the same principle as commodities, supply and demand. The value goes up when there are very few of them, and you have to approach the game in that way and not just evaluate your chances as equal because of other factors like obstacle bishop ending or general things you would think of. Let's watch how Vishy converts this. F6 is played, which is a good move by Karjakin because I got to get this bishop out of here so I at least have a chance to challenge the rook. But unfortunately, he still never gets that chance. The rook comes to d6 and I quickly double, and you never have the ability to bring the big exchange that you'd like. Because of that, White stays in control over the most important squares on the board, expands on both the queen side and the king side. If you haven't noticed, as I said, play tickle on both sides of the board because your opponent can't really challenge you. He plays b5. Again, this is good anchor chess because if you take, I take, and my c6 pawn may end up being the dominant pass pawn that wins the game. So you're not interested in that, but guess what? At some point here, I'm going to try to bring my king into the game. Notice that even once I get the rook to c7 here, which is a very cool idea, I still control the open file. You still can't play rook d8 or rook d7, even with my threats of bringing the other rook in and with your fear, so to speak, of taking here and giving me the pawn. So the open file that was controlled by Vishy and his understanding of how dangerous that could be, despite Karjakin's underestimation of it, is what ended up getting to this position here. Now, after king to f8 and c4, Black decides it's time to no longer just sit passively and wait. The king will come in. We will get h4. We will get active. And eventually, you're just going to see the black pieces be under pressure. So Karjakin makes a good practical decision. He thinks it's time that I can get away with this. And maybe by giving up one pawn, I'm able to simplify everything. Unfortunately, although he had the right idea from a practical perspective, he fell short on the execution. Only one move here maintained serious drawing chances for Black. And if you've already watched the Karjakin interview with Peter Dockers, then you might know what that is. That move was f5. He needs to play it and just give up another pawn. He needs to not worry about it. The point is, if I take and then trade on e8, if I take g5, you can actually just gobble up h3 because your bishop defends c8 from all the way over there. If I take and try to move the rook away, you win my bishop. And again, your bishop is guarding the key square. So probably what you'd see is something that goes like rook here. If we get a big trade, takes and takes, yes, maybe White still has some winning chances because the pass pawn on c7 is not going to disappear immediately. It's a very dangerous pawn. But it's hard to see where Vishy might have had more concrete winning chances. Maybe rook e5, and if takes, again, you can take here, but still, Black might be taking h3, and these pawns are not leading to anything immediate. Yeah, you have a trick. If I take, you win immediately on the spot, but I don't have to take it. I can play king to f6, and now I'm hitting your rook, so bishop to g5 check doesn't work. So I didn't analyze everything for hours or by force, but f5 I think was agreed by both players as Black's last chance. But after rook to c8, f5, bishop d7, and now h4, Black makes the blunder that he can never look back from with g6, creating just too many pawn trades. When a very subtle move comes in, Black's pieces are overwhelmed. rook to d4. Very nice, hitting the bishop on e8. What's the point? You can't play bishop to e8 because rook down to d8, and you're in big trouble. If I guess you could do it that way too. You could just take on g6 and then play rook to d8, but it's the same thing. White is winning a piece. So black played rook takes c7, but now you're able to take here, which threatens bishop to f4, again removing the rook and winning, which means black doesn't have the time to liquidate everything, and he's going to be going down a pawn by 4. Still, you can't take because bishop f4, so the bishop had to move. We establish f6, and the rest was a grind affair. I think Karjakin still thought he might have decent drawing chances for a while, which makes sense. But the truth is, this extra pawn and the lack of coordination in black's pieces were just really tough. A nice repetition here, maybe trying to bait Vishy into taking because he might get himself in some kind of mating net, but Vishy's too smart for that. He comes back and guards it, and after a5 begins the plan that I really loved. He would like to somehow find a way to get the king to g5, not the bishop to g5, because that'll hit g6, force passive play, and ultimately win the game. It takes a few moves, but after some tickle, he's actually able to get exactly that. The bishop comes to h4. Note the cool thing that white didn't take a5 because king to b7 would surprisingly trap the rook. I thought that was sort of instructive. After king to b7, the rook moves, though, and eventually this king is getting to g5. With it, the rooks come to e7, and black just resigned here. Vishy probably could have played other ways, too, and kept going forward, but rook e7 is the most simple. The point is that after takes, black has no way out with the king, and we end up running into some serious problems because once you're stuck, I go after the a-pawn, and the line will win with the a-pawn pushing to a queen. So phenomenal chess by Vishy. Phenomenal. This may have been my favorite game. And again, we were joking about how we don't want to see Vishy Carlsen rematch 3, but he may be playing the best chess of anybody in the world right now besides Magnus Carlsen. So why not, right? Let's check out the standings. We have Fabiano Caruana and Vishy Anand tied for first. Both of those players winning this tournament would be well-deserved. As we look ahead to the round 12 pairings, we have Svidler versus Giri, Nakamura versus Anand, which will be a big game because Hikaru has scored very well against Vishy, especially as of late. So if Hikaru with white can do some damage to Anand's chances, that might be the thing that helps his countrymen, right? If Hikaru takes down Vishy, that may be the reason why Fabiano Caruana wins the candidates. You heard it here first if that happens. Sergey Karjakin, of course, still with plenty of chances right there at 6 points. Gets Veselin Topalov, and Fabiano Caruana takes on Levon Aronian, who after this horrible loss today doesn't seem to have nearly as good of chances, right? He's down to 5.5. But the truth is, at 5.5, Svidler, Giri, and Aronian are not out of it yet with a few rounds remaining. We still have a lot to go. I'm very excited. We'll look forward to all of your comments. Please like our video. Please leave a comment and let me know what you're thinking about the analysis. If it's too detailed, if it's not, leave a comment here in the YouTube video. Give us a like, give us a subscribe, give us a share, and watch all of the candidates coverage here on our YouTube channel because we know you don't have 6 hours for the whole thing, so just check out the highlight after each day's play. Thank you, everybody, and we'll see you on Chess.com.